A lot of functions, we're going to be creating a lot of different formulas. So it's really important that before you even begin to get into the more intermediate and advanced options or functions, that you understand the basics. So that's really what we're going to focus on in this very short section. Is we're going to run over some of the basic functions, and I'm going to show you a few different ways that you can utilize them when you're working with data before we move on to the intermediate and advanced functions. So let's jump into our first example. Now, before we get going, let's just understand the data that I'm using in this particular lesson. So this is sales data that we might want to analyze. Now, it's not a particularly large data set that I have here in terms of columns or in terms of rows. If I press Control down arrow to jump to that last row, you can see that we have 96 items in this particular data set. So not a huge data set. It's showing me different companies within the UK, or the largest companies within the UK. And then I have a breakdown of the sales in billions, the profits, assets, and then the market value. And I want to perform some calculations on these figures that we have here. Now, what you'll see over to the right-hand side is that I have written out there those basic functions that I want to run through in this module. So those would be sum, average, count, count A, min, and max. And it's really important that you understand how you utilize these and how they work, and also the different ways that you can use them. Now, if you're anything like me, the sum calculation is normally the first function that you ever use in Excel. And it's simply there to add up a range of numbers that you've selected. So all I'm going to do here is a very simple basic sum calculation. I'm going to type equals in. I'm going to type in the word sum, and you'll see I get that helpful menu appearing underneath, which is showing me all of the relevant functions. I'm going to double click to select sum, and then I get my arguments. So my first argument is showing in bold. It's asking me what numbers do I want to sum together. Now in this case, I'm going to sum together the sales that are showing in column C. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the top cell just here. I'm going to press Control Shift down arrow to select all of that column, and then I'm going to close off my bracket and hit Enter. And you'll see that that's now giving me my answer. Now, if you're thinking that looks a little bit strange, remember that these calculations are in billions. So that is the first way of creating a formula. Very simply, equal sign, type in your function, and then select your cell range. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to do a similar thing, but in a slightly different way. So this time we're going to work out the average sales in column C. Now, instead of typing equals average directly into the cell, this time I'm going to use the functions dialog box, which you can pull up by clicking on this little FX icon next to the formula bar. And you can see as I hover over, it says insert function. So what I can now do is I can type in a description if I'm not particularly sure what I'm looking for, or if I know the exact name of the command, I can just type it in, click on go, and you can see it's the top one in the list. So I'm going to double click to select it, and what I get is this function arguments dialog box. Now, sometimes people find this a lot easier to use than just typing it directly into the cell. So I will leave that up to you. Whichever one is your personal preference, the one you find easiest, then go ahead and use that. Now what we're going to do here is pretty much exactly the same as what we did for the sum calculation. So I'm going to move my little dialog box over to the right hand side, and where it says number 1, I'm going to select the first cell in column C, which is C2, Control Shift down arrow to select everything, and you can see it's now got C2 to C96, which is my cell range, and if I click on OK, it's going to give me my result. And again, remember, these figures are in billions. Now the next two functions, count and count A. These are fairly similar, but I do find sometimes people aren't really sure what the difference is. Now what count will do is we'll count the number of items in a selected range. But count only works if the data is numerical. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to type in equals. We'll type in count, and just to keep things consistent, I'm going to select the same range, Control Shift down, close off my bracket and hit enter. And you can see it's telling me that there are 95 items in the range that I've selected. So currently that's working fine because the range that I selected had numerical values within it. But what if I try and use count on this column just here, column B, which has text values in it? Let's see if it works. I'm going to delete out, equals, count, open bracket. I'm going to select B2 this time, Control Shift down. And if you're wondering where I'm looking, it's up in the formula bar where I can actually see my formula. Close off my bracket, hit enter, and what do I get? I get 0. So that illustrates very nicely that you can't use count on text fields, it only works for numerical values. So the difference between count and count A essentially stands for count all. So this function will count everything, whether it's numerical or text. So that's particularly good if you have a column that has both numerical and text values in the cells and you want to count them, you would use count A. So let's go back to count and let's construct this in a slightly different way to what we've done before. What I'm going to do this time is I'm going to introduce a named range. And named ranges are really good to use in formulas because they sometimes make your formulas a lot easier to understand and also make them a lot quicker and easier for you to construct. So before I start my count formula, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to name the range of cells in column C. So I'm going to click in the top, Control Shift down arrow to select everything, and I'm going to name this range of cells. So up in the top left-hand corner, currently where it says C1, if I hover over, it says Name Box. I'm going to click in here, and I'm going to call this range, just call it Sales. Now, when you're naming your ranges, an important point to note is that if I wanted to call this Sales Data, for example, I must not have any spaces in between the two words. So I couldn't have sales space data. It has to be sales data, all one word, or sales underscore data. Hit enter to confirm that named range. So now that I've named that range, essentially what I can do is I can use the range name in my calculations instead of having to select the range every single time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say equals, we're going to do count. I'm going to open my bracket and I'm going to start to type the name of my range, which was sales. And you can see that Excel has brought it up in a little list underneath. There we go. We have a table symbol. It says sales underscore data. I can double click to select it, close my bracket, hit enter, and I get my result. So for anyone looking at this particular formula, that's actually a lot easier for them to interpret. They can see, okay, we're doing a count of the sales data, and you can see it highlighted there within the data as well. Now, using named ranges is all well and good, but if you have quite a lot of them in your worksheet, you might not be able to remember what you've called every single one off the top of your head. So there's a useful little feature in Excel where you can essentially browse through all of the named ranges that you have. So let's try that out with this count A option. I'm going to say equals count A. Remember, this one will count everything, numerical or text. Now, instead of typing in sales data to reference column C, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the F3 key on my keyboard. And that's going to bring up this little dialog box that's going to show me all of the named ranges that I have in my worksheet. So I can go through, I can say, yep, that's the one I want, double click to add that in, close my bracket, and there we go. Now, if you're wondering why there is a discrepancy between count A and count in this instance, it's because count A will count the title of column C because it's text, whereas count won't, and that is why you get that slight discrepancy. Now, the final two functions that you really should know are min and max. And what these two functions will do is they will show you the minimum value in a range of cells or the maximum value in a range of cells. And again, we're going to do these in a slightly different way. What I'm going to do this time is I'm actually going to put all of my data in a table. So I'm going to click in my data. I'm going to press Control A to select all of my data and Control T to quickly create a table. It's got the range of my data, and then I'm saying, yes, my table has headers, Click on OK, and my data is now in a table. And I'm going to name this table. So this is very similar to naming ranges. When you create a table, it's always good to give them a meaningful name. So you can see now, if I go up to the table design ribbon, the first group that we have here, the properties group, we have table name, and Excel has given my table a generic name of table 2. So I'm going to click in there, and I'm going to call this UK underscore largest and hit enter. So now if I wanted to find the minimum value in column C, I could utilize the table name. So I'm going to type equals min. I'm going to open my bracket and I'm going to start to type the table name. So UK underscore largest, Excel's brought it up for me. I'm going to select it and that selects the whole table. But now if I want to zone in on one particular column, so in this case column C, if I type a square bracket, you can see that Excel magically brings up all of the columns within that table for me to select. So I want to find the minimum value in the sales column, so I'm going to double click sales $billion. And then the last thing I need to do is just close off that square bracket that I opened. Hit enter, and it's given me a result of 0.60. And once again, remember, these are in billions. So let's finish off this by doing our final one, which is max. So I'm going to say equals max, open bracket, and I'm going to do F3. I'm going to say sales data, close the bracket, hit enter, and there we go. So hopefully that's given you a good recap on those fundamental basic functions, what they do, and also we've thrown in there some different ways that you can construct your formulas. That's it for this module. In the next module, I'm going to be running through the basics of absolute versus relative referencing, which again is another super important skill that you need to make sure you understand before progressing on to some of the more intermediate and advanced topics. So please join me in that module.